ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is, again, the Tuesday edition of Point of View. This is a great opportunity for you, as we are going to, in the first hour, talk about your relationship to God, and then we'll get back into the issues in the news, of which we have quite a bit. Of course, we've had the riots in Los Angeles, but not just there. Just a few miles away from where the studio is, there was a confrontation and even a blocking of a bridge, so this is something that has broken out all over the country. We're going to talk about who were some of those detainees that were, after all, so controversial. Where were they detained? Was that part of the issue? How were they funded? And all sorts of questions that you would really expect the mainstream media to cover. But we haven't seen so much of that, so we will spend some time in the second hour getting into those issues, and then we'll move on to some other issues as well. That is not the only topic there. Matter of fact, over the next couple of days, we're going to talk about some very important Supreme Court decisions that have come down that you need to know about. We're going to talk about how, in some respects, the political realignment, as we mentioned even on Friday, is changing, and so we're going to get into quite a bit of conversation. But we're going to focus some of our time and attention on a new book, Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God. Now, if you've been listening to Point of View any length of time, you might remember we did an interview with Kenneth Samples. This was one that was in the Worldview Bulletin, Divine Hiddenness, a Sender or Receiver Problem. As a matter of fact, those of you that have followed the ministry that I've been involved with, a few decades ago, we had a chapter that dealt with God's hiddenness. And when we seek God, sometimes it seems difficult to find him. And Jeffery Leonard is helping us understand a little bit about more of that, especially as we look primarily at the Old Testament, which is his expertise, although we go to the New Testament as well. He has his doctorate from Brandeis University. He's a professor of biblical studies at Samford University. He's also the co-chair of the Biblical Hebrew Poetry Program Unit, which is part of SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature. And I had seen his earlier book, Creation Rediscovered, Finding New Meaning in an Ancient Story. Dr. Leonard, welcome to Point of View.
It is such a delight to be with you, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, get into the broad issue, and then I want to take people through, if we can, a brief summary of 180 pages. There's a lot there and 11 chapters, but it does seem to me that part of this gets back to your own experience. You open up by talking about being at Mount Arbel. I've been there as well with some of our different individuals, and really just sort of seeking God and dealing with this in your own personal life. Can you share that?
Well, you know, the genesis of this book came from really just a really difficult experience that we had in our own department at Samford. We had a beloved professor, a dear friend of mine, who just over the course of the summer when we were all locked down for COVID, we were getting prayer requests from our department to hear about him, and they just really took on a more and more somber tone. So I finally just reached out to him and said, hey, is it a good time to call? And I tell you, from the first moment that he spoke, you knew something was wrong. He couldn't find the words, and this is someone who was just the most eloquent person you could imagine.
Right.
And he stumbled. He tried so hard to find the name of a particular city here in Alabama that everybody would know, couldn't find it. And this conversation went on like this for a half hour, I guess. And I tell you, when I hung up the phone, I just wept.
Yes.
Because what was this guy going to do, robbed of his power of speech? The trouble is, as the months went on, he finally got his diagnosis, and he had a terrible condition called Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease that was universally fatal. So God had never chosen to heal somebody of this before. It didn't seem likely he was going to choose to do it now. And so we just sort of walked through this process of knowing our dear friend is going to die. And the worst part of it all was that at the very same time, I was with my students in a class on Psalms and wisdom literature, walking through the book of Job. And so here are these students, and they're just crying out, where is God in all of this? And that really was the moment when I said, I've got to take this topic on. This is just, truthfully, they're asking the right question. God, where are you in a moment like this?
I'm glad you've actually dealt with it, because as you've heard me mention, we have dealt with it on this program. I've dealt with it in a book or two, but it isn't something that we talk about, but it is important. But even, let's go to Elijah. Elijah has wondered, where is God? And first of all, there's an earthquake. God's not in the earthquake. Then there's a storm. God's not in the storm. There is a fire, not in the fire. And eventually a quiet voice. And so sometimes, as you point out in the various chapters, we're seeking God in Scripture and nature and humanity and worship and silence and doubt and suffering, death, joy. There seems to be different ways in which we connect up with God, but still, for the average Christian, God seems elusive, hence the title of your book.
Indeed. And I think one of the main conclusions that I came to was that this elusiveness of God, it's, to use the phrase, it's a feature, not a bug. That there is something about the hiddenness of use, as you have said, or the elusiveness of God that is absolutely vital for our having a right understanding of who God is. There is this element of, it's a subject I don't think we talk enough about, but it's the freedom and independence of God, his transcendence, his inability to be pinned down and controlled. And it seems that Scripture would say that the only way for us to truly grasp that freedom, that independence, that transcendence, is for us to be in the position of having to seek after God. That when we have, for want of a better way of putting it, it's almost like when we have too much of God, we become complacent and we minimize who God is.
Yes.
There's something about that need to struggle that is what enables us to see God for who he really is.
We're going to take a break, and again, as you point out in the beginning, for those hardy enough to make it through all 4 hours without commercials of Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, remember, of course, the scene where God writes the words on the tablets, but I think there is a sense when oftentimes we're looking for, if God would just show up, if God would just perform a miracle, then I would obey, and yet we illustrate the fact that even in those passages later on in Exodus, God shows up and performs miracle after miracle after miracle in terms of the plagues and judgments, then parts the Red Sea, and what's the next thing you see is the rebellion of the Jewish people. In the New Testament, the same thing. Jesus performs countless miracles and even raised Lazarus from the dead. And you think certainly that would cause everyone to be a believer, and they just had even more rekindled anger and a desire to go and to put him to death. So sometimes we are looking for something which we're convinced is absolutely going to cause us and our skeptical friends to believe. And I think we have enough evidence in Scripture to show that that isn't always the case. We're going to get into some of the different aspects of the chapter in this book. If you're interested in it, I suspect you might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about Dr. Jeffery Leonard as well as the book Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God. It's on our website, and we'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The budget bill that Congress considered had a provision requiring states to enforce a work requirement for able-bodied individuals on Medicaid between the ages of 19 and 64. Dr. Merrill Matthews makes a case for the provision in a recent commentary. He was on my radio program recently to explain why he believes it is a good requirement. Let me first explain there are exceptions made for those who are disabled, pregnant women, incarcerated, or in a rehabilitation program. Also, you can fulfill this requirement by looking for work or receiving job training. The leftist criticism is that a work requirement to receive federal benefits is punishment. Dr. Matthews counters requiring able-bodied people to work for their taxpayer-funded benefits, whether it's food, housing, Medicaid, or other means-tested assistance programs, is not punishment. Think of it this way. Approximately 165 million Americans under the age of 65 and their dependents, about 60% of the population, currently have employer-provided health insurance. They work for their health insurance. It is a benefit, not a punishment. Developing a good work ethic will lead to a personal and financial success. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men." He also teaches in 2 Thessalonians 3, "If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Dr. Matthews ended his commentary by mentioning encouraging stories he and others have heard about people regaining their dignity by once again providing for themselves and their families. They discovered that work is empowering. He found they just needed a little push to get started. I believe it's time to get Americans back to work. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Jeffery Leonard. The book is entitled Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God, Embracing Hope in Seasons of Darkness. Dr. Leonard, let's, if we can, maybe point out that oftentimes when people are seeking God, they want to go to first the tabernacle, then the temple. But there is kind of an interesting switch, especially with to the New Testament, because in one of your chapters, you do have a quote from Paul. And the particular, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a group of people from Point of View come with me to Athens, standing right there in Mars Hill, looking at the Acropolis and the Parthenon. And in the midst of that, Paul says, God does not live in shrines or temples, depending on which translation you have, made by human hands. And the implication is you've got a temple up there to Athena, and yet nevertheless, that's where you think you find God, but that's not God. God is not limited to a tabernacle. God is not limited to a temple. And in some respects, that was even a lesson that he had to teach to King David.
You know, we may well have been on top of the Acropolis at the same time. I was in Greece just a couple of weeks ago myself, so you should have waved while you were up there at least.
Yeah.
We, I actually think that this transition from tabernacle to temple is one of the key ideas really about describing the elusiveness of God. You know, if you remember when David, he looks out and he says, here I am living in this palace of cedar, but there's God living in a tent. Well, I need to build a house for him. And his prophet Nathan says, well, you know, you're the king, do what you want. But God comes to Nathan that night and says, you know, who do you think you are to build a house for me? You have misunderstood our relationship. I'm the one who builds houses for you, not you building houses for me. And it's revealing a kind of danger that was there in the temple. One of the keys to the tabernacle was this very notion of God's being elusive. It's a tent. It's movable. You can't pin it down. Anytime God wants, he can pick up stakes and go to the next place. Even inside the tabernacle, it's the flapping of the tent, covering there, or it's the smoke and the fire that, I mean, you can see them, but you can't quite grasp them. There's this element of God's elusiveness there. When you switch to the temple, things get very dangerous for Israel, because there's a temptation to think, once I've built God a house, I've domesticated him.
Yes, and put him in a box.
Now,
yeah,
exactly. He's tied down. Where's he going to go? And so this became a terrible temptation for Israel to imagine we can pretty much act the way we want to, because it's not like God can leave. And that's why the prophets have to come back, and Jeremiah says, oh yeah, look what I did to my house at Shiloh. And Ezekiel narrates the departure of the presence of God from the temple and says, okay, Babylon, it's not my house anymore. You can come in and destroy it. So it was a danger for the Israelites the moment that they got it into their heads, we've tied God down.
Wow. One of your chapters is Seeking God in Nature, and I've said before that one of the things that causes me to have such great appreciation for Christian camps is when you put God's Word with God's world. There's some things that happen there. And, of course, you have in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. In the New Testament, you have, of course, Romans 1 and all the passages there about the fact that God has really shown his eternal nature, his invisible attributes, power, and dignity. All of that is certainly seen in nature. So there's a pro and a con to that. And I'd love to have you kind of work our way through that, because there is a sense in which we get a sense of awness about God in creation. But we have to be careful that we don't worship the creation rather than the Creator. Can you explain?
Indeed. In fact, I think it's so interesting that nearly every time that one of the biblical authors will criticize idolatry, their counter to the notion of idolatry is to emphasize God's role as creator. That it just becomes laughable that some little trinket or statue could be the creator of heaven and earth, as the God of the Bible is. And so this was a tension that they thought that believing rightly in God as creator was actually an antidote to worshiping the creation. That if you understood how glorious the creator was, you wouldn't be tempted to reduce God to, some, as Paul would say, some depiction of an animal or a creeping thing, or, even a human statue. So they looked at creation as the antidote to worshiping the creation.
So again, that I think is a great illustration of the value of being in the creation, and I think we sometimes become very disconnected from the seasons and the rhythms of nature. And a little bit later, when we talk about silence and some of the other issues, we can see the value of getting back to nature, because it helps us maybe commune with God, but there's, of course, the danger. But I thought before we take a break, one of the others, which will probably be the most puzzling chapter in the book, is Seeking God in Humanity. Now, you're honest enough to talk about the fact that sometimes it takes a little bit more work to see God in human beings, but help us out with that.
Well, you're exactly right. If you there's the familiar story of Dorian Gray, where at least when he does bad things, it only affects his own picture. It only affects himself. So often, the bad things that we do as human beings end up affecting our view of God, that we'll have, it's just sort of a part of reality that, for example, the relationships that we have with our parents oftentimes affect how we end up viewing God. So our flaws as humans can hurt others. We're fallen. And so we bear the image of God, but we do it in a broken fashion. But even though that image of God is broken in us, there is still an element of Scripture saying we're created a little bit below God, that we are invested with the divine image. When we look at another person, we are seeing the reflection of God in that person, once we discount for the fact that we're fallen and sinful. And so I think it behooves us to do what Jesus did and to look for the best in human beings. Jesus was able to marvel at the faith of a centurion who wanted his servant healed, or a woman who was willing to reach out and touch the hem of his garment, or an old woman who was giving her last 2 coins to the temple there. Jesus finds the kingdom of God in the face of a child, or in a person who loves somebody else. He even thinks that a Samaritan, of all people, can be an illustration of the image of God. So I think Jesus, there is no question that he saw the sinfulness of humanity. But at the same time, he also encouraged us to look for the best parts of the image of God that are reflected in human beings.
Very good. And again,
absolutely.
that's all part of the book, Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the book, let me just mention that we do have a link so you can get it in paperback or Kindle. Probably could find it in your local bookstore, but if not, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Jeffery Leonard, we did mention the fact that he actually helps you explore the land. So the link that we have there is biblicalexplorations.com. So if you'd like to know more about some of the things that he is doing there or like to communicate with him directly, we've made that possible. Of course, we have a link to some of his social media contacts and the rest, and so that's all available at the website at pointofview.net. We'll come back and get into a couple other aspects of the book, but we did send to you an email that came out yesterday or early today, depending on when you might have received it, and it's just a reminder that back in 1972, when Point of View was founded, and if you start doing the math, I guess we're up to, 53 years, there were three needs: to create a source of information that looked at issues objectively without the kind of bias that seemed to be so prevalent at the time. Number two, a source that covered topics that many people wanted to have covered that were largely ignored. And then a source that examined each issue from a distinctly Christian perspective, because the need for us to really develop and to articulate a biblical worldview. So again, this newsletter and this particular email went out, and of course we have some links that we would point you to on the website as well. And the reason we do this is, if you've noticed, we're in the month of June, and by the end of this month we will end our fiscal year. This is a very important time for us. As I said just the other day, maybe even more important for us to do well by June 30th than even sometimes to do well by December 31st, as important that one is, because this helps us to see what we have as we go into the summer, help us really to develop a budget and to actually use the resources that you can provide to us in a strategic way. So I want you to begin thinking about how you can support this ministry between now and the end of this month. And if you would like to know more about some of this, of course, you can, go to our website, pointofview.net. A couple buttons that say donate now. You could click any one of those, but most importantly, if you haven't read the email I sent out, I'd encourage you to read it. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Jeffery Leonard right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Jeffery Leonard. He is the author of this book, Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God. Let me commend you his previous book, too, Creation Rediscovered, Finding New Meaning in an Ancient Story. We do have a link to his website, biblicalexplorations.com. There's a contact point there where you can either leave your name and address and information, or there's even his email and address and telephone. And I thought for just a minute, since we did talk about the fact that you are over there in Greece and you've had many trips to Israel and others, let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about that, because Dr. Leonard, I've had a lot of people say, I've read the Bible and it was sort of like in black and white, and then I went to the Holy Land, or we went to Rome, or we went to Greece or Turkey, because we would go to Ephesus, and it just became in full color. And I'm sure you've had that experience and had people tell you that that was their experience.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny because when I'll teach this introductory course that I teach at Samford, I'll sometimes have students who have been to the Holy Land with me, and for them, the experience of going through the Bible is so much richer, because I'll say, hey, do you remember when we were standing there on Mount Precipice and we were looking over this way? Or do you remember when we were there at Corsi and we were talking about the Gerasene demoniac? And it just comes alive for them as they can see the backdrop that's there. And there's no experience that I would suggest for a believer that would rate as much as going and actually, I take them to the creek bed where David picked out his stones to, use the sling and go against Goliath, and they can just visualize, oh, there are the Philistines right there on those hills. It is such a treasurable and memorable experience to do that.
Well, I'm sure people would benefit by knowing more about that. We do have those links on our website, also visually for people watching online on Facebook or whatever might be watching on our stream. So we have all that links, and those links are on the website as well. Let's get back to your book, because that's another reason why people might want to contact you, to see how they might want to teach that in their small group, their Sunday school class, or even pastors listening now might want to teach that from the pulpit. And one of your chapters is Seeking God in Worship. That one's sort of obvious, because how many times have we felt so close to God in the midst of a worship experience? And that makes a great deal of sense, but there are lots of verses in even the Old Testament, not to mention in the New Testament, that talk about the value of seeking God in worship.
This was an interesting chapter for me to work on, because I have to confess my priors. I'm just a low church Protestant. And so in my, growing up, we would have said that we had just dispensed with ritual altogether.
Yes.
Now, of course, that was not true in any respect. If you were to look at our bulletins from one week to the next, our pattern of worship was every bit as fixed as the Latin Rite. We just thought that we had gotten rid of ritual. And I think part of the reason we wanted to get rid of it was we thought that ritual was dead, and that it was deadening, that it would hurt our faith. Well, one of the things I had to explore in this chapter on worship is how much the Bible endorses ritual as a way of keeping you moving when you don't feel like moving.
Right.
It's not to discount the danger that's there, that ritual can become a replacement for something that is genuine and from the heart. But there's also something about making a commitment to say, I'm going to church every Sunday, no matter whether I feel like it or not.
Right.
I'm going to say the blessing before my meal, whether I feel like it or not. And it keeps you moving in times when maybe you just don't really feel like moving. And if you move long enough, then maybe you'll feel like it again.
Yep.
It's sort of the opposite of when, God bless them, I have students who will drift long enough. And if you drift too long, you find it hard to make your way back.
Yes.
Ritual can kind of help you stay there so that the path is not so great.
And we see that a lot in human life. I mean, people that are sometimes talking about trying to be successful in business, fake it till you make it. Here you're talking about make a decision with your brain, even if your heart is not in it. Daily quiet time, it's rare that somebody wakes up and says, well, I just can't wait to see what's in God's word today. You know, that you have to sometimes force yourself, and then your emotions catch up. And there is a sense in which the rhythms of life, the various traditions were very essential. And if they weren't essential, then what with all the various traditions and seasons and various celebrations in the Old Testament if they weren't there for those reasons? So I think you've got some really great points there, but I'm going to keep the train moving down the road because you've got so many great chapters. One is seeking God in silence. That, I think, is very difficult in this fast-paced, frenetic, 24/7 lifestyle world, and yet that may be one of the more significant chapters. And again, I started by talking about Elijah. He didn't see Elijah didn't see God in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire, but in the quiet, whispered voice. Talk about that, if you might.
You know, I just think it's so vital for us. You know, one of the things I talk about in that chapter is in the 8th century BC, Israel had this brief moment of prosperity before the empires started to wash over the nation and really oppress it. And that prosperity, it actually ended up with some negative effects. Amos is going to have to get onto the people because they are exploiting and being unethical in their practices towards the poor, for example. Hosea has a different take, though. His concern is that when Israel received prosperity, they attributed it to the wrong source.
Yes.
They attributed it to the god Baal. And what's so fascinating about the way that God responds to the prophet is he says, I'm going to strip away all of that prosperity, and I'm going to take them back to the wilderness. I will allure her, and she'll respond to me as she did in the days of her youth. It's this language that's so marital, as it's almost like a couple that's struggling, and they say, we're going to go back to the place where we honeymooned, and there we'll rekindle our romance. And this is what God says for the nation. Prosperity was just too much for them. What they need is that time in the wilderness where they can figure out what's truly important. But, you know, you absolutely nailed it. Our world is not going to go gentle into that good night. There is going to be a text and a new episode and a call and a letter and a bill that are not going to want us to get away from it all. And so I think our world's going to fight and not want us to have those alone times.
Well, if we can now get into some of the more difficult chapters, but this is what I think stimulated your book in the first place. Seeking God in doubt, seeking God in suffering, even seeking God in death. What about this idea of doubt? There is, I think, tradition that some Christians have bought into that you should never have any doubt. And I'm thinking, how in the world you could come to that conclusion by looking at the amount of doubt that some of the patriarchs and even some of the great heroes of the faith had. But nevertheless, we can very easily have spiritual doubt. We can very easily lose hope, and that's one of the reasons why Scripture addresses that issue.
Indeed. In fact, the person that I really focus the chapter on is Jesus himself. That, you know, Jesus went through probably the most profound moment of doubt that any person has ever experienced when he was there in the garden. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to have to go to the cross. He knows what awfulness lies in front of him. He says, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. And the thing is, you know, the kind of doubt that Jesus was wrestling with is the one that I think affects us the most, or at least the most, poignantly. You can doubt God's greatness. Has he promised something that's too big for God to accomplish? But I don't think that's what we usually wrestle with. What we wrestle with is when we're doubting God's goodness, that we know he has the power to do something, but he's not doing it. And this is what, you know, the psalmists, they constantly cry out. They don't ever cry out about, well, God, I just wish you were powerful enough to do X or Y. What they cry out for is, God, I know you're powerful enough to do it. In you, our ancestors trusted. They trusted you and you delivered them. But God, here I am and you're not delivering me. It's those doubts about God's goodness that are the tough ones. Jesus went through that same doubt, but he didn't let that doubt stop him from pursuing God. The way out was not to solve the doubt. it was to just keep pressing on, even though we still felt that doubt.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll finish off a few of the other chapters, Seeking God in Suffering. Of course, that takes us to the book of Job and other passages as well, Seeking God in Death, and then Seeking God in Joy, and understanding how this all comes together. Part of the book, Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God, Embracing Hope in Seasons of Darkness. Dr. Jeffery Leonard is the author, and again, we have information about him and the ministry that he's involved with as well. Of course, those of you that might be interested in going to Samford University, you might want to check that out as well, since he is a professor of biblical studies there. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with him right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Jeffery Leonard. Again, the book is entitled Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God, Embracing Hope in Seasons of Darkness. And Dr. Leonard, now I guess we're back to where we started, and that is Seeking God in Suffering. That was certainly one of the things that was the stimulus, because as you're teaching through the book of Job, and you're talking about the genre, and you're talking about wisdom literature and all sorts of other aspects, and whether it's Job or the Psalms or Proverbs or others, there is a real sense in which that is where sometimes our search for God is the most dramatic, sometimes the most frenetic. What are your thoughts?
Well, there are 1,000 different questions that one can deal with in theology, and truthfully, almost none of them trouble me. I just figure that most of them are above my pay grade. One day I'll stop seeing through a glass darkly and I'll see face to face. But if I wrestle with something, it's what most of my students wrestle with. It's when the kind of suffering that a person goes through doesn't seem to line up with the character of the person who's suffering. That, if it's a terrible person and they, are suffering, they're just desserts. But when it's my beloved grandmother dying from Alzheimer's, that's when it's hard to get your head around it.
Right.
And I think, there's no book of the Bible that deals with that more than Job. That here is this person who, the book goes out of its way to describe him 3 times as upright, blameless, fears God, turns away from evil, and yet he suffers like no one else. And I think this book is trying to wrestle with, what do we do when we suffer? And, not to put too fine a point on it, I think what the book is really trying to wrestle with is, what do we do when it feels like God is acting outrageously? Now, over a long enough timeline, I don't believe God acts outrageously. I believe when we get to heaven, we'll understand exactly the logic of everything God has ever done. But in the moment, we do have that question, why? Because we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Job is there to do is to say, just keep coming, just keep lamenting, just keep pursuing. The only thing in the whole book that God is not willing to put up with Job is silence. When he finally just says, okay, fine, I won't talk anymore, God says, nope, that's the one thing I don't want. I can take your laments. I don't want your silence. You just keep coming after me. And if you'll do that, we can work this out.
You have a chapter as well that relates to that as well, seeking God in death. And of course, that came in part from the loss of your friend. Recently, we did a whole program on Ecclesiastes and the questions and comments of Koheleth, who is the individual that is actually talking about the fact that when you look at so much of life, it is vanity of vanities. There is a sense in which sometimes it doesn't make a great deal of sense. And if you're really looking for fulfillment, it's almost like trying to grasp water because it just flows through your hands, and there isn't anything permanent. And in some respects, suffering raises those questions. The death of a loved one raises even more, doesn't it?
Indeed. I love your illustration that life does kind of slip out of our hands like water, and I think that's a good illustration of the way Kohelet would put it. I love the book of Kohelet, but bless his heart, he was struggling. He just was trying so hard to find an ultimate meaning to life if life has a final ending at the grave. And I think it's from this point forward that God starts to lead his people toward a more clearly defined idea of the afterlife. And it's just the most beautiful idea, because as God is leading them, what creates Israel's conviction in the afterlife is their belief in the justice of God. That if God is not balancing the scales in this life, it must mean he's going to do it in the life to come, because we know that God is just. That's the way that Abraham puts it when he's arguing over the fate of Sodom, is he says, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? He just holds that as a fundamental conviction. God's going to do the right thing. And this is why, people of faith have come to believe God has a world in store for us, because we know God is a good God and a just God. So we can deal with death. It's just a matter of how do we deal with death. And so I talk in the book about a couple of things. First of all, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. It's just the curse of, our telling ourselves in Western society that when you're young, you ought to go and sow your wild oats. And then when you're older, you can worship God. And the Bible would just flip that on its head and say, why create scars on your heart that you will wrestle with the rest of your life? Serve him when you're young, so that you have the energy and the joy and the passion to do it. And all of those terrible things that will haunt you for the rest of your life, you can just, as Psalm 1 would say, just say no to those things. And the happiness that will visit you throughout the rest of your life. It's seeking God while we're young, not old.
Great way to end it because, of course, you've talked about seeking God in doubt, in suffering, and death, and didn't want to end on a negative note because you have a chapter on seeking God in joy and seeking God in Christ. But just in the few minutes we have remaining, I wanted maybe you to just talk about how people might want to use this book. Certainly, if you're a seeker, this would be maybe helpful to understand what the Bible says about those issues. If you're a Christian who's still just kind of struggling with the elusiveness of God, this would certainly be helpful. But the way you've put it together as a professor in biblical studies, I suspect that many of our listeners that have a small group, a life group, a Sunday school class, maybe some that are even maybe wanting to take this and preach it from the pulpit, you've put it together in a way that perhaps would be very useful. And if they wanted to contact you to find out more, I suspect they could do so.
Well, truthfully, this series began, or this book began with a teaching series at a Sunday school class. That as I was trying to wrestle with the death of my friend, that somebody approached me and said, "Hey, could you do a Sunday school series on encountering God?" So I started looking at, we could have burning bushes here, and we could have, Elijah with the silence. And I said, we can't duplicate any of those things. What does it really mean for us to seek God? And so each week I just talked about a different way that we could seek God. We want to experience God's presence. How do we get ourselves sort of into the pathway that will carry us back to God? And so indeed, every chapter is set up in that way. It starts off with dealing with the issue and then ends with, here are some, usually 3 different ways that we could seek God in death or in doubt or in suffering. So I think it lends itself, and deliberately so, for just that kind of study.
Again, Seekers in the Hands of an Elusive God, Hendrickson Press and Publishers. But again, we have information about that on our website. Also have a link to biblicalexplorations.com. So if you wanted to contact Dr. Jeffery Leonard, you can do so. And if you're a young person thinking about going off to college, you might check out Samford University. He could be one of your professors. So, Dr. Leonard, been a delight to have you on the program. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much. It was a real treat.
Going to take a break, but let me again point you to that email that I talked about earlier. 3 reasons why Point of View was started, but also 2 very good reasons why you might want to support Point of View. Point of View has been around for half a century, and it is a proven, consistent, and trustworthy voice. And also, it is a way in which we try to equip you to live out the Christian life and to even be able to contact individuals in Congress or others and to really make a difference. So we want to equip you, we want to empower you, we want to encourage you. And if we've been doing that over this last year, I hope that you will consider what you might do to support this ministry. If you have not had a chance to look at that email that we sent out, I would encourage you to do so. It has the subject, New Generation, Same Mission. We're going to take a break, though. We have a lot to talk about in the news, and that's coming up right after this.
In 1972, Point of View was founded to address 3 needs in America. First, to create a trustworthy source of information without the liberal bias pervasive in the mainstream media. Second, to cover issues that real Americans needed to know about, issues impacting faith, family, and freedom. Finally, and most importantly, Point of View was founded to examine each issue from a Christian perspective, anchoring Americans to biblical truth once more. Thanks to support from people like you, Point of View has successfully carried out this mission for 53 years. But if we want to carry the mission forward into the future, we need your help today. This is a critical time of year. Point of View depends on listeners like you to donate generously. Forge ahead into the future with us. Give today at pointofview.net. or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I just mentioned that we're going to spend some time, for a while at least, talking about the riots. And I'll say the riots in Los Angeles because those have been the most intense. But as I mentioned just last hour, just a few miles from where we're broadcasting, there was a confrontation yesterday, a closing down of a bridge for a period of time. And you're going to see these all over the country. And that is going to be even more intense come Saturday. Thought I'd give you a preview of coming attractions. Saturday, June 14th, will be a nationwide demonstrations with the theme No Kings. Now, the argument is that we have King Donald Trump. Of course, you know where we're going with all of that. And these images out of Los Angeles may be just a preview of coming attractions. Gary Bauer in his piece even says it could be a watershed event. And in some respects, the day coincides with something that was selected a while back by President Trump, the 250th anniversary of the United States Army. Well, there are plans for at least 1,500 sort of anti-Trump, anti-American protests around the country. It is a coalition of all sorts of different far-left groups, and I will get into that in just a few minutes. But we do have some articles here that kind of give you both perspectives on this. Both of them recognize that the riots are wrong, but maybe come in a little different perspective so that you can kind of think that through. But it was interesting. Just the other day, I was reading one particular reporter that was asking of his fellow reporters, have we just completely abandoned the way in which we do journalism? You remember journalism is who, what, when, where, why, and we don't seem to even be willing to put some of the basic information out. And I don't know if it's just incompetence, or if I got that information out, then you wouldn't come to my assumed conclusion that I'm trying to force you to. So let's just for a moment, before we get into some of these articles, ask at least a couple of questions. And one of those is who? Who is going to be deported? I can't find, until I dug a lot deeper, any news report that even told you who are the people that were going to be deported, who are the people that were discovered at Home Depot. And I'll get to that in just a minute. My first article is Home Depot can't be off limits. I mentioned that one yesterday. And so let me give you 5 names. And these come from the White House because you can't seem to get it too many other places. But the first one is Rolando Veracion Enriquez. He is a Filipino national with convictions for rape, convictions for assault, burglary, and theft. Okay, so he was one of the individuals being picked up. Number 2, Chong Chan Phan. He is a Vietnamese national. He was also arrested. He's a gang member. He was arrested back in 1994 for participating in a gang-affiliated murder of 2 teenagers in a graduation party. Number 3, Eswin Uriel Castro. He's a Mexican national with convictions. Are you ready for this? Child molestation, being armed with a dangerous weapon. He has previous arrests and a rap sheet for robbery and domestic violence. And he had already been deported. They caught him and want to deport him once again. And then we'll get, I'll just make four. Cielo Vivar Ubaldo. He's a Mexican national with convictions for sex with a minor, narcotics violations, also violations of hit and run. And so these are the individuals who were going to be and were rounded up and will be deported. And those are the individuals, if you think about it, that the people in the streets throwing rocks, throwing pieces of concrete, throwing fireworks, assaulting police officers, that they're defending. Now, they really aren't. They are, in some respects, once the action unfolds, I don't think if you were to interview anybody out there assaulting the police officers or setting fires, that they even knew necessarily the nature or the nationality of these individuals. But it's a good question to ask people that think maybe the Trump administration has gone too far, or that we would be better off if we hadn't called the National Guard, or we would be better off if we simply tried to de-escalate the situation. Because will, in this particular case, Los Angeles be safer with these individuals? And by the way, I picked four at least so that you can see. One's from the Philippines, one is from Vietnam, two are from Mexico. So it's not just rounding up, Hispanics or something of that nature. And so that's the who. The where was interestingly enough. That's our first article. Rich Lowry says, certainly the left is opposed to immigration enforcement as such. But it turns out that the big red line was, are you ready for this? Home Depot. The trigger of the Los Angeles anti-ICE riots were a raid on one of the retailer's home improvement stores, followed up by a false rumor of another raid at a different Home Depot. By the way, it was not a raid of a Home Depot. I'll get to that in just a minute. And he says, apparently the stores are to be considered little islands of lawlessness in every community, protected locations where ICE can't get within a certain distance, like a gun-free zone for illegal aliens. Now, if you read the actual story, it's interesting. Typically, the store that is nestled among the Los Angeles riverbed would be filled with weekend warriors tackling home improvements, workers collecting supplies, and immigrants in search of work. But that morning, Border Patrol agents were spotted across the street from a Home Depot gathering around 9 a.m. Word spread quickly in social media. Passerbys honked their horns. Soon protesters arrived, and the whole Home Depot store closed down. Well, it turns out what happened is there was no raid on Home Depot. It just turns out that the agents were using a DHS, that would be Department of Homeland Security facility, adjacent to the door of the store. And as a result, all of that was for naught. But that's what was the trigger. And so again, as he's asked, what do they expect? Home Depots have become perhaps the foremost symbol of open, routine defiance of U.S. immigration laws, with legal immigrants gathering en masse for everyone to see and getting hired by people who know they are breaking the law in doing so. And, of course, in some respects, people place the blame on Stephen Miller because a couple of weeks ago he asked some ICE officials, why aren't you at Home Depot? Why aren't you at 7-Eleven? And again, day laborers shouldn't necessarily be the most important focus on that. But the goal here, if nothing else, would be to certainly prohibit employers or people that want to pay under the table individuals here illegally. And because of some of this, you have individuals now saying la vida aquí la sirve, which means life here doesn't work anymore. And so the goal here in many cases has simply been to provide enough pressure that individuals would give up and self-deport themselves. But nevertheless, you've learned a little bit more about who and where. We'll get into some other aspects of that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The budget bill that Congress considered had a provision requiring states to enforce a work requirement for able-bodied individuals on Medicaid between the ages of 19 and 64. Dr. Merrill Matthews makes a case for the provision in a recent commentary. He was on my radio program recently to explain why he believes it is a good requirement. Let me first explain there are exceptions made for those who are disabled, pregnant women, incarcerated, or in a rehabilitation program. Also, you can fulfill this requirement by looking for work or receiving job training. The leftist criticism is that a work requirement to receive federal benefits is punishment. Dr. Matthews counters requiring able-bodied people to work for their taxpayer-funded benefits, whether it's food, housing, Medicaid, or other means-tested assistance programs, is not punishment. Think of it this way. Approximately 165 million Americans under the age of 65 and their dependents, about 60% of the population, currently have employer-provided health insurance. They work for their health insurance. It is a benefit, not a punishment. Developing a good work ethic will lead to a personal and financial success. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for men." He also teaches in 2 Thessalonians 3, "If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Dr. Matthews ended his commentary by mentioning encouraging stories he and others have heard about people regaining their dignity by once again providing for themselves and their families. They discovered that work is empowering. He found they just needed a little push to get started. I believe it's time to get Americans back to work. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Your thoughts about these riots, are they actually increasing people's desire to deport some of these criminal elements, or is this backfiring against the Trump administration, and will that bring an end to some of the actions by ICE? I'd love to get your thoughts, 1-800-351-1212. We've talked a little bit about who and even why these individuals would be deported. And I'd certainly ask you to think about any searches you've done on the internet, any radio programs you've listened to, any TV programs you've watched, and which you actually learned who some of those individuals are and why they were being deported. That, I think, if nothing else, makes the case that I mentioned just a minute ago for why you might want to consider supporting what we do here at Point of View. But there's some other issues as well. One of those, which I'll get to in just a minute, is how. How is all of this orchestrated? How is all of this financed? And again, there's some great material and information out there, but it just never seems to make it to the various news copy of the press or even some of the broadcasts that we are watching. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But let me give you a slightly different take, because as you well know, the Wall Street Journal is a little less supportive, that's probably an understatement, of Donald Trump. And so they have put together, first of all, an article. It's our second article for you to read, The Deportation Wars, in which they're warning about the fact that there could be, and probably will be sooner or later, an overreaction. And some people already think there has been an overreaction from the Trump administration. So again, the editors put it this way. Rounding up and deporting millions of illegal migrants was never going to go down without a protest, but President Trump is determined to do it, and no one can say he didn't tell the voters during the campaign. But there are risks on both sides of this dispute, especially for a country if it turns violent and triggers a military response from the president in the administration. First of all, they're critical, and I think there's some valid concerns about this, of invoking a little-used law to override what is typically state control of individuals who are part of the National Guard. And that is, we do have what is called an Insurrection Act, which allows you to deploy the military. But again, when he sent 2,000 troops from the California National Guard without the permission of Gavin Newsom, as I pointed out yesterday, Gavin Newsom, the governor of the state of California, has brought suit against the federal government. I don't see it going too far. Maybe you'll find a federal judge that will go along with that, maybe even the Ninth Circuit, but I can't see this getting even to the Supreme Court. But we'll see. That's one of those things that is certainly the case. And the desire here is to recognize that it's one thing to round up individuals who are a criminal element and are here illegally in most states. It's quite another when that's happening in what are called sanctuary states. And as a result, Gavin Newsom has said there was no need to call in the Guard. And that may be true, according to the editors of the Wall Street Journal, but that doesn't mean that then they can simply step back, because if indeed you did not want to call in the National Guard, that means that if you're running a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state, you better need to maintain order, and that is the case. And that's difficult to do when, as they point out, Representative Maxine Waters says she wants the protesting crowds to grow and grow and grow, which in some respects plays into his hands. And one of the other articles, which I did not post, but you can find on the Wall Street Journal as well, Democrats make Stephen Miller's day. Will Democrats ever learn, they ask, a political lesson on immigration and crime? It doesn't appear so, judging from the response to the migrant protest in Los Angeles that turned violent on Sunday night. Chaos on the streets will increase public support for a hardline restrictionist agenda. And again, the desire to sue the federal government, we'll see where that takes us. But again, the editors of the Wall Street Journal, not exactly fans of Donald Trump all the time, say we do need to recall how the Antifa crowd and other extremists hijacked protest after George Floyd's death in 2020. Ditto, they say, anti-Israeli protests at the University of California at Los Angeles that turned bloody. And even after the Dodgers World Series victory last autumn, revelers looted businesses, torched city buses, and hurled firecrackers at police officers who tried to bring them under control. And so the argument right now from the governor of the state of California, Gavin Newsom, is law enforcement didn't need help. Although I gave you a quote yesterday from the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department saying it was out of control, that Trump shouldn't have sent troops. And in some respects, that has become destabilizing, and we will see. Now, of course, sending in 700 Marines probably won't be in the streets, but ostensibly there to protect federal buildings. So again, if you want to win over the American people, heading out into the streets with all sorts of Mexican flags, and in a minute I will point out that some of the other flags were like Soviet flags and Hamas flags, having signs that say California's stolen land, chanting, "We don't want ICE or police," and then throwing firecrackers, actually chipping off pieces of cinder block and throwing them. Then one particular case, torching some of these driverless cars. I only found out later what they had done is they actually called those driverless cars on some kind of Uber device and then set fire to them. So this is not the way to win over the hearts and minds of the American people. And I think it again illustrates some of the connections to the far left, which, just before we take a break and then we'll move on to some other topics, is to get the how question. How is all of this being funded? Well, it turns out that you can go to a couple of places. For those of you that have access to X, I would encourage you to go to one particular post by Data Republican. Data Republican always says Data Republican small r, in which Data Republican has pointed out that a number of these NGOs, what's an NGO? Non-government organization, have been implicated in this. Foremost has been a group called the Coalition for Humane Immigration Rights, or CHURLA. And again, you can see some of the pictures here of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. These are signs that were actually produced by that organization. Then there's a second part 2 about hundreds took the streets, blocking roads, attacking federal officers, even burning flags. How this was, again, funded and coordinated. And you can go on to X right now and find that from one of the groups I found most helpful is Data Republican, which has the facts and figures, all sorts of details showing the funding. But we've oftentimes encouraged you to get Gary Bauer's end of day report. And yesterday's end of day report actually has a whole section on who's behind this. And he says there's an entire ecosystem of far-left nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations behind the mass migration open borders movement. Many of these organizations are funded with your tax dollars. Thankfully, the Trump administration has been ending some of that, hence some of the rage that you're starting to see in the streets. He says, for example, one of the leading groups behind the anti-law enforcement Los Angeles riots is the group I just mentioned, CHURLA, the Coalition for Humane Rights. They were awarded $34 million in government contracts, including rum from California's Department of Homeland Security. And signs from some of them come from, as I mentioned a minute ago, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. One of those individuals, of course, was involved in that shooting there of the embassy workers. And he goes on to give you then the names and lists some of the key individuals, including some of the billionaires that have actually funded that. So again, it is not open for some debate as to what is happening, who is involved, how they're being funded. And again, if you feel like the news that you're getting and information you're getting from other sources is adequate, well, that's great. But if you appreciate the fact that over just the last half hour, I've probably given you some facts and information that you don't hear anywhere else, I hope you might consider what you might do to support this ministry, because indeed we want you to be able to understand some of these very important issues. When we come back, I'll make just a brief comment about how there are some in the Democratic Party that are starting to speak out against it, but many are not. And then we're going to move on to some other very important issues, because yesterday we wanted to get to a very good piece by Jason Riley on how many of these minority voters are changing who they're voting for, and maybe even a little bit about military policy that we've learned from what happened in Ukraine. All that coming up right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, our third article that we're going to be talking about in just a minute is one by Jason Riley, Why Democrats Are Losing Minority Votes. Now, I do it for a couple reasons. First of all, Jason Riley is African American, has been looking at the minority vote for some time. Number two, he cites some of the very same statistics we talked about on Friday when we were quoting from William Galston. You might say, okay, who's William Galston? Well, he has participated in virtually every Democratic presidential campaign. He was the deputy domestic security advisor for Bill Clinton. He's a very well-known Democrat and was writing in a very timely piece, in a sense, to Democrats saying the election of Donald Trump was not a one-off. It wasn't an exception. It shows a remarkable change taking place. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. But in some respects, what we've just talked about over the last half hour relates. There's a very good piece by Noah Rothman who points out that the way in which right now Democrats and especially sort of leftists and progressives have tried to address this is to say, well, the thing you need to know about the riot in Los Angeles is you really don't need to care about it. In addition, Donald Trump is president. Have you accounted for that? Because, that's why we're having the problem. And if anything, it was the administration's mistake of deploying 300 National Guard troops to the city. Those are kind of the 3 points he makes and said, this attitude outlined above is on full display right now with the L.A. riots and amounts to a tacit admission that the Democratic Party in California and elsewhere understands the extent to which it has become associated with what he calls violent hooliganism of the sort. Progressive-owned statements reflect their desired and deserved insecurity and extent which they know that these rioters really kind of are their people. And so there's been a real attempt to try to discourage any statement about this. He goes on in the next paragraph to say former Vice President Kamala Harris did not even acknowledge the violence. Instead, she deemed the demonstrations as overwhelmingly peaceful and civic-minded and really just criticized the Trump administration for deploying the National Guard. And even Gavin Newsom said, don't give Donald Trump what he wants. You've heard some others say, don't give Stephen Miller what he wants. And in a sense, there is a problem, as he points out, that Democrats dare not acknowledge that in some respects these people in the streets are the people they depend on to vote for them. And they, again, this very good piece by Noah Rothman is they don't have to be. Matter of fact, they shouldn't be. But that's one of the reasons why you have so few Democrats speaking out about what is happening in Los Angeles right now. So let's give credit where credit is due, because I saw this very good article. This Democratic senator is the only one in his party telling the truth about the L.A. riots. Okay, that's clickbait, so I click on it. Guess what it was? Senator John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. No surprise there. He has been suffering from a character assassination by the liberal press because many times he has not been willing to go along with his fellow Democrats on issues ranging from Israel and Hamas to, in this particular case, the L.A. riots. Let's allow him to speak. This is what Senator John Fetterman said. I unapologetically stand for free speech, peaceful demonstrations, and immigration. But this is not that. This is anarchy and true chaos. My party loses the moral high ground when we refuse to condemn setting cars on fire, destroying buildings, and assaulting law enforcement. And in a sense, he is aiming much of his criticism at fellow Democrats like Gavin Newsom, the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, and others. So again, even when we are changing topics to what does this next election look like, Because let's recognize that by this time next year, we will already have picked in most of our primaries the people that will be running for the midterm elections. And this is where Jason Riley's piece, it's our third article on the website, so you can read it, said that even though you've had individuals like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez denouncing Republicans as oligarchs, nevertheless, millions of blue-collar voters flocking to the Republican Party remain unpersuaded. And again, uses some of the very same numbers and statistics that were cited by William Galston, an individual that served under Bill Clinton's presidency. For example, Donald Trump, they say, has increased the Republican Party's share of presidential vote in each election he's been on in close to half of the counties in America, 1,433. Just think about that. Almost half of the counties in America are more likely to vote red, more likely to vote Trump, more likely to vote Republican than ever before. Of course, we did, in my commentaries mentioned last week, there are a few counties, very few, in which there was evidence of it turning more blue, but mostly turning red. Worse for the Democrats, Jason Riley says, who have been indulging in class warfare. Only 3 of those counties had a median household income of more than $100,000. So the bottom line is that we used to talk about the Republican Party decades ago as being the party of the wealthy, and the Democratic Party being the party of the working man. It is almost completely flipped. And today, it's the elitist, the individuals that have college degrees or graduate degrees who make more than $100,000 a year that are more likely to vote Democratic. And instead, it is the working poor, it's the blacks and Latinos, Jason Riley says, who are overrepresented among the lower income voters and those without college degrees, and that's why Democrats have been losing ground with the non-whites. Here's one of the quotes from the New York Times. The erosion of working class support among black, white, and Latino voters alike has unnerved every ideological wing of the Democratic Party. And so again, Jason Riley, as an African American, says while most blacks still remain loyal to Democrats, in his 3 presidential campaigns, Donald Trump has made serious inroads in heavily black counties across the Deep South and beyond. And as a result, he goes on to say, minority voters are courted as minorities rather than Americans in the various Democratic Party strategy. And they fail to recognize that minority voters shouldn't be recruited as minorities, but as Americans who have the same priorities as other Americans: good schools, safe neighborhoods, gainful employment. And as instead, Democrats have pretended that Hispanics don't care about illegal immigration or that blacks think policing is a bigger problem than crime, even though the polls have consistently pointed in the opposite direction. And he says the irony is that black support for law enforcement, even after George Floyd's death, remained above 50%, notwithstanding efforts, he says, by liberal activists, academics, cable news commentators to shrink police budgets and curry favor with black voters. This comes as no surprise to anyone who listens to residents of high-crime neighborhoods and not to the intelligentsia who claim to speak for the black underclass. So again, what you can see is that if you really want to reach out to Americans, you know, crime control is important. And the statements being made right now that we want to get rid of the police, we want to get rid of ICE, they really aren't resonating well with a lot of those individuals that are watching those protests. Because again, whether you're a minority voter or a majority voter, you still want pretty much the same priorities as any American: good schools, safe neighborhoods, gainful employment. And this particular piece by Jason Riley is just a reminder of that. And even though he is an African American, primarily, I think, looking at this more from a conservative point of view, you have others, people like William Galston, who instead are actually saying the same thing to his fellow Democrats. If we don't turn this around, you always expect that the party in power loses seats in the House and the Senate, because indeed that generally tends to be the case. That may not be happening in these midterm elections, and these kinds of riots possibly could have an impact in the negative sense to the Democratic Party. And that seems to be what Jason Riley is talking about, even though he was writing about much of this before we've had the riots over the last couple of days. Be interesting to see what he says in his follow-up column. But if you'd like to read it in its entirety, it's our third article on our website today at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Just before the end of the program here, let's change topics for just a minute because there is a lot of other things taking place. We're going to do our best later in the week to get into some of those. But today, I thought I'd just mention the fact that our fourth article has to do with the drone strike by Ukraine. And it really relates very much. I'll hold this up right now. This is the July issue of Outlook. You should be looking for it in your mailbox if you are a supporter. This one has to do with America First. You'll see, first of all, an article that I've done on China and some of the concerns we have there, as well as one of the other articles I've written on foreign policy and the new axis of evil. You'll also see a very good article on the issue of tariffs, and this one comes by Liberty McCarter. And our good friend Gary Bauer, who I mentioned just a minute ago, has a piece on restoring respect for America. We recognize that even though right now we're focusing a lot of time and attention on what's happening in Los Angeles, immigration is a big issue, the big beautiful bill is an issue, all sorts of other topics, we aren't going to forget the fact that we do have some enemies, and that particular article I've written gets into the fact that we kind of have a new axis of evil that includes Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea. So we are going to be paying attention to that as well. And the other aspect of that is it gets us into the issue of military policy. This article that comes again from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal says that Ukraine's drone strike is a warning for the United States. They say by now Americans know that Ukraine's remarkable drone strike on Sunday that damaged as many as 40 aircraft deep inside Russia as strategic bombers sat there like ducks in a row on military bases. One urgent lesson, they say, beyond that conflict is the U.S. homeland is far more vulnerable than most Americans realize. So again, we're now a week away from that. And one of the questions being asked by a military analyst was this: could those have been B-2s at the hands of Iranian drones flying out of containers, let alone maybe drones from the Chinese? Let's face it, the American strategic bomber fleet is relatively small. It's about a third the size it was during the Cold War. It's concentrated on a handful of bases. We've talked about the fact that the Chinese sometimes have purchased land near some of those bases. That should be concerning. They go on to talk about the fact that President Trump has planned what's called a Golden Dome missile defense shield, and that is something that is in the current budget to begin. And also there are people that are saying right now to try to skimp on defense spending. They were talking about just try to put shelters over these B-21 bombers that we have right now, the new B-21 bombers. And if you think about this, that would leave them vulnerable to the drones. And so they're saying not building $30 million hardened aircraft shelters for the B-21 bombers, they think would be an unwise decision that could endanger the U.S. abilities to strike globally. So we're going to have to start thinking about that right now, and that's another issue that needs further consideration. Right now you have what is called the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission, and it warned 2 years ago that the U.S. needs better integrated air and missile defenses against coercive attacks from Russia and China, and that attack could even come from various conventional weapons. And so again, if you're thinking about what could happen in the Taiwan Straits, that is of concern. And if nothing else, these are very significant issues to be addressed. So the bill moving through Congress right now would spend $25 billion for a Golden Dome, which would look a lot like the Iron Dome in Israel. And so, again, as we're trying to make choices about what to fund and what not to fund, certainly defense is another issue to think about, and to recognize that this was a good example of what we oftentimes refer to as asymmetric warfare. This was brought about by something as simple as drones, put in containers that were remotely opened up and allowed the drones to then come attack those strategic bombers in Russia and had such a devastating impact. So it's an illustration, again, that we can't take our eye off the ball. We need to recognize that we live in a very dangerous world, and even though domestic issues right now are front and center, we can't neglect those military issues as well. And again, one of the reasons why we encourage you to consider what you might do to support this ministry, because tomorrow we're going to get into some other aspects of this. Very good piece that came out by Jeff Blahar, all the radicalism combined into one. If you've been watching what has been taking place in the streets, and it has a great picture of one man on one hand holding a Mexican flag, on the other hand holding another flag of another country. Sometimes you've seen flags of the Soviet Union. You've seen flags of Palestinian flags. You've seen Hamas flags. This is what's called omni-cause leftism. You know, the same people that were out there protesting Israel and protesting for Hamas now are out there protesting immigration. They're all part of the same group, and in some respects, whenever there is a call for protest, they're ready to answer the call because we frankly have been funding them in some cases, and other billionaires have been funding them in the very significant ways. We've talked about this today here on Point of View, but just before we wind down today, let me mention again that you probably received an email from me in which we talk about the new generation, same mission. Talked about the three needs which existed back when Point of View started in 1972, a need for a good and sound source of information without liberal bias, the need to cover issues that the mainstream media just simply will not cover and don't plan to cover, and then most importantly, to look at those issues from a distinctly Christian perspective so we can help restore a biblical worldview in America. The argument was very simple. We certainly do believe that you can support this ministry and should support this ministry because we've been a proven and consistent and trustworthy voice, and also that we have done all we can to equip you, empower you, and encourage you with facts, information, and even a whole section called Take Action that allows you to contact your member of Congress. So again, as we come to the end of this fiscal year in June, I hope that you'll consider what you might do to support this ministry, and you can certainly find out more about how to do that by contacting us through a variety of different buttons. We have a very large button that says Donate Now, another one that's down further that says Donate Now. Of course, you can also subscribe to the Viewpoints commentaries, the one today on welfare and work. We're going to talk about that tomorrow because there was a very interesting comment that came out of a Supreme Court decision in that regard. So we'll get into that as well. And all of that is available at our website at pointofview.net. Again, I encourage you to support your church. I encourage you to support this radio station that carries this program, if indeed they're non-commercial. But I hope that you will also support this ministry, and I would encourage you to visit the website to find all the articles we've been talking about today here on Point of View. Lastly, I want to thank Megan and Doug for their help behind the scenes engineering the program. And I want to welcome back Steve. He gave me this particular bookmark from London. So, Steve, thank you for joining us once again and producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
In 1972, Point of View was founded to address three needs in America. First, to create a trustworthy source of information without the liberal bias pervasive in the mainstream media. Second, to cover issues that real Americans needed to know about, issues impacting faith, family, and freedom. Finally, and most importantly, Point of View was founded to examine each issue from a Christian perspective, anchoring Americans to biblical truth once more. Thanks to support from people like you, Point of View has successfully carried out this mission for 53 years. But if we want to carry the mission forward into the future, we need your help today. This is a critical time of year. Point of View depends on listeners like you to donate generously. Forge ahead into the future with us. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.